Welcome to Sunday Ripple. I'm Rob Anderson. Each week we explore scripture and the ripples it can create on our everyday lives. Sometimes we're going to reflect on Sunday's message. Sometimes we'll dive into other passages that speak to where we are. Whether you're a Christian or just tuning in for a thoughtful conversation, this podcast is here to help you reflect and grow and keep the message moving through your week. Let's get into it. Hey friends, Rob here, and today I want to start off with a story that still makes me squirm a little when I think about it. Years ago, I was working for a local cable provider in Oregon. Things were going well. I'd worked hard to prove myself. And one week, several leaders at different levels of the company approached me privately and encouraged me to apply for a pretty big promotion. It was flattering. Honestly, it felt good to know that my work had been noticed. The role came with more money, more responsibility, more influence, all the things you're supposed to want. But here's the twist. That very same week, my wife and I had already decided I was going to resign. Not for more money, not for more prestige. In fact, the role I was stepping into was with a much smaller company. It was just in the town we actually lived in, and it came with way less money, a lot less. But for us, it was the right decision because it meant being present in the same community where we were doing ministry, where our relationships were, where our impact could be more personal and meaningful. And let me tell you, it was hard. Saying no to that promotion, to that recognition, to the financial benefits, it felt uncomfortable, even irresponsible in some ways. But it was the right no because it freed me to say yes to the right thing. Jesus lived in that same kind of tension all throughout his ministry. He said no to good opportunities, to people, even to expectations placed on him, not because he didn't care, but because he cared most about the Father's will. And if we look closely, his boundaries teach us something powerful about our own. So today, we're going to talk about how Jesus' no's actually show us how to say yes. Yes to God's calling, yes to healthier priorities, yes to a life that truly matters. When I turned down that promotion years ago, I wasn't saying no to something bad. It was actually a really good thing. Higher pay, more recognition, a clear path forward in the company. The leaders who encouraged me to apply weren't wrong. From the world's perspective, it was a smart move, but here's the tension. Sometimes the good isn't always the right. Let me repeat that. Sometimes the good sometimes the good thing isn't always the right thing. And if you chase every good thing that comes your way, you'll end up missing one of the things that God's actually calling you to do. Jesus modeled this over and over again in his ministry. In John 6, Jesus performed the miracle of feeding 5,000. The crowd was buzzing with excitement. They wanted to make him king by force. Imagine the scene. He could have had instant popularity, instant authority, instant influence. For many people, that would sound like the dream. I mean, isn't the goal to climb to the top so you can make the biggest impact? But Jesus saw through it. Verse 15, it says, perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. He said no, not because kingship was a bad thing, but because it was the wrong thing at the wrong time. His mission wasn't to take the throne in Jerusalem. It was to take the cross on Calvary, and the crowd's good idea would have pulled him off course. Another example comes early in Mark's gospel. Jesus had just spent the evening healing the sick and casting out demons. The whole town of Capernaum had gathered at the door. If there was ever momentum to build on, this was it. But the next morning, Mark tells us that Jesus slipped away while it was still dark to pray. And when the disciples finally tracked him down, all flustered, they said, "Everyone is looking for you." If it were me, that's when I would have said, perfect, let's go back, fire up the fog machine, launch a new series, and capitalize on this energy. Let's go. But Jesus didn't. No, instead he said, let's go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that's why I came out. He said no to another night of healing ministry in that town, a good thing. That healing ministry was a good thing. But he said that no so that he could say yes to the broader mission of proclaiming the kingdom everywhere. Here's what's striking. Most of the temptations that you and I face aren't temptations to do blatantly evil things. Very few of us wake up in the morning and say, you know what would be fun today? Ruining my life. No, the real danger is being pulled into good things that aren't God things, opportunities that seem right on the surface but distract us from what's essential. Think about your own life. Have you ever filled your calendar with so many good commitments, work projects, volunteer roles, social events, that you had no margin left for what really matters? Have you ever said yes to an opportunity just because it looked impressive, but deep down you knew it wasn't aligned with your calling? That's where boundaries come in. Jesus wasn't being selfish when he withdrew or redirected. He was being faithful. His no wasn't a rejection of people. It was a commitment to his Father's will. Boundaries are like fences around a garden. They aren't there to keep good things out. They're there to keep the right things growing. If Jesus hadn't said no to becoming king, he might have been celebrated in Jerusalem, but never crucified at Calvary. If he hadn't said no to staying in Capernaum, the gospel might have stalled out in one region instead of spreading to the ends of the earth. His no's preserved the yes that changed the world. Now, I'll be honest. I do struggle with this. Saying no feels uncomfortable. It can feel like I'm letting people down or wasting an opportunity or even being ungrateful. Sometimes I'll say yes out of guilt, out of pride, or just because I don't want to look lazy. But here's where the humor sneaks in. Some of us are so bad at saying no that we end up volunteering for things we don't even like. Have you ever been at a church meeting and suddenly you're on the committee for the annual pancake breakfast, even though you don't even like pancakes? That's what happens when you can't say no. You end up flipping flapjacks at 6 a.m. wondering how you got there. But when I look at Jesus, I see freedom. He didn't live bound by guilt or obligation. He wasn't controlled by the crowd. He was anchored in the Father's will, and that gave him the courage to say no, even when the thing in front of him was good. So here's the question for us. What good things are you saying yes to that might actually be keeping you from the right things? Maybe it's a job opportunity that looks great on paper, but deep down, you know it'll pull you away from your family or the ministry. Maybe it's another commitment on your calendar when what your soul really needs is rest. Maybe it's the pressure to impress others when God's simply asking you to be faithful. Jesus shows us that it's not only okay to say no to good things, it's sometimes essential. Because every no is really about protecting a bigger yes. Okay, if this first part showed us that Jesus said no to good things, then this next part's going to take it up a notch. He also said no to people. That might sound a little jarring at first. I mean, isn't Jesus the one who welcomed children, healed the sick, and invited sinners to his table? Well, yeah. But even though his heart was open to people, his mission wasn't open to everyone's agenda. One of the clearest examples of this is in Matthew 16. Jesus tells his disciples that he's going to suffer. He's going to be killed and raised again. Peter, good old Peter, pulls him aside and says, "Never, Lord. This is never going to happen to you." No way, man. On the surface, Peter's response sounds caring. He doesn't want his teacher, his friend, to suffer. That's a good impulse, right? But Jesus turns and says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but the things of man." Dude, talk about a hard no. He didn't just brush Peter off. He rebuked him sharply. And why? Because Peter was tempting him with a shortcut, a version of the Messiah's mission that didn't involve the cross. Jesus wasn't rude. He was resolute. He said no to Peter so he could say yes to the Father's will. Another moment comes in Luke 9. A man tells Jesus, "Hey, I'll follow you wherever you go." Sounds enthusiastic, right? But Jesus replies, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Translation, if you follow me, you need to know this isn't about comfort. Then another man says, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. And Jesus responds, let the dead bury their own dead. But you go and proclaim the kingdom of God. Another says, I'll follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family. Jesus replies, no one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God. These sound like pretty harsh no's, but what Jesus is really doing was he was exposing the divided hearts of the people in front of him. They wanted discipleship on their own terms. Jesus said no to people who wanted to negotiate the cost of following him. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes we need to say no to people too. And that's hard. Many of us are wired to please others. We want to be liked, to be seen as helpful, to avoid conflict. Saying no feels like rejection. I can remember back when I was a staff pastor, there'd be weeks where I'd get a lot of requests. Hey, can you meet? Can you come to this event? Can you join this committee? None of them were bad things. They were all good, heartfelt requests from people that were good people. But there were only so many hours in the week, and I had a family and a full-time job. I had a ministry focus. I had my own walk with God to protect. Learning to say, I'm sorry, I can't, was one of the hardest but healthiest disciplines. I once heard someone say that you can't, when you can't say no, you'll end up at a birthday party for someone's cat holding a paper plate of Costco sheet cake, wondering where your life went wrong. And that's what happens when you don't draw boundaries with people. You end up exhausted, overcommitted, and missing the things that God actually called you to. What I love about Jesus is that his no's to people were never about selfishness or arrogance. He wasn't dismissing them as unworthy. He was focused on his mission, and he wasn't willing to let other people's desires, even well-meaning ones, put him off course. Think about it. When the Pharisees demanded signs, Jesus said, heck no. When the crowd demanded more bread, Jesus said no. When Peter begged him to avoid the cross, he said no. Every no was rooted in a deeper yes. So, what does this mean for us? Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say no. Not a harsh, prideful no, but a clear, gentle one that says, I can't give you what you're asking because I need to be faithful to what God is asking. Maybe you need to say no to a friend's pressure to compromise your convictions. Maybe you need to say no to a boss who keeps piling on more work at the expense of your family. Maybe you need to say no to a ministry role because you know your soul needs rest. Here's the reality. If you can't say no to people, you'll never be free to say yes to God. When Jesus said no to people, he wasn't rejecting them. He was protecting his mission. He understood that no in the moment could lead to a greater yes in eternity. And that's the invitation for us, to live with the kind of clarity and courage that allows us to say no when we need to, so that we can give our full yes to the one who truly matters. Okay, so if saying no to good things was hard and saying no to people was harder, then this next one might be the hardest of all. Jesus said no to expectations. People had all sorts of ideas about who he should be, how he should act, and what he should do. And over again, he refused to be squeezed into their molds. Think about his very first miracle. In John 2, Jesus and his disciples are at a wedding in Cana, and the wine runs out. Mary, his mother, comes to him and says, they have no wine. It's not a crazy request. She's not asking him to part the Red Sea or raise the dead. She's simply asking him to help a young couple avoid humiliation on their wedding day. But his response is striking. Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come. Mary's expectation was that Jesus would solve the problem right then and there. And he eventually did, but on his terms, not hers. He wasn't going to be pressured into action before the time was right. Another moment that comes is in Luke 12. Someone in the crowd calls out, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." That's a very practical request. It wasn't even selfish. This man just wanted justice. And who better to settle it than Jesus, the wise rabbi who preached about fairness and righteousness, right? But Jesus said, "Man, who appointed me as a judge or an arbiter between you?" Translation, that's not my role. Jesus didn't let other people's expectations define his mission. He knew what the Father had sent him to do, and it didn't involve being a referee in family squabbles. There's another powerful moment in Mark 3. Jesus' mother and brother, they come to see him while he's teaching. The crowd tells him, "Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you." In that culture, family ties and obligations were sacred. The expectation was clear. Stop what you're doing and go honor your family. But Jesus says, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And then he looks at those seated around him and says, "Here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." That was a radical, radical thing. I mean, that was a super crazy no to cultural expectations. He wasn't dishonoring his family. He was expanding the definition of family to include all who follow God. Why does that matter? Because we live under the weight of expectations every single day. Expectations from family, coworkers, friends, society, even the church. Parents expect us to live up to their hopes. Bosses expect us to always be available. Friends expect us to show up for everything. Culture expects us to be successful, productive, and impressive. But when you try to live up to everyone's expectations, you end up exhausted, scattered, maybe even resentful. Have you ever noticed how expectations sneak into the tiniest things? Like when you go to a potluck and someone says, "Oh, I expected you to bring your famous chili." I actually won a chili contest once. Maybe I have heard that before. But suddenly you're like, wait, was there a sign-up sheet that I missed? Expectations can feel funny in small ways, but in bigger ways, they can be crushing. Jesus shows us that it's okay to let people down. That sentence feels uncomfortable to even say, doesn't it? But it's true. Jesus disappointed people. He let them walk away when they didn't like his teaching. He refused to be their bread machine, their miracle dispenser, their political hero. And why? Because he wasn't here to meet human expectations. He was here to fulfill divine purpose. So here's the key question. Whose expectations are you living under? Are you saying yes to something only because you don't want to disappoint your parents? Are you saying yes at work because you're afraid of what your boss might think, even though you're already stretched too thin? Are you saying yes at church out of guilt instead of genuine calling? The good news here is Jesus' example frees us up from the tyranny of other people's expectations. If he could look at his own family, his own disciples, and the crowds around him and say, "No, that's not what I'm here for," I think we can too. When Jesus said no to expectations, he was actually saying yes to freedom to live out his mission without compromise. And when we follow his example, we experience that same freedom. We don't have to meet everyone's demands. We don't have to carry burdens that aren't ours. We just have to stay faithful to the path God has placed in front of us. That's where the joy is found. That's where the peace is found. Not in living up to every expectation, but in living faithfully under God's direction. So by now, we've seen that Jesus said no to good things, to people, to expectations. But here's the question that hangs in the air. What do we actually learn from all this? Because it's easy to admire Jesus' boundaries in theory, but when it comes to practicing them in our own lives, that's where the rubber meets the road. The truth is, boundaries are not about being selfish. They're about being faithful. They are the guardrails. Keep us aligned with God's calling instead of drifting into everyone else's demands. Sometimes we confuse boundaries with selfishness. We worry that if we say no, we'll look uncaring or unspiritual. But think about it. Jesus had perfect love, perfect compassion, perfect obedience, and he still said no. If boundaries were selfish, then Jesus wouldn't have had them. Instead, his boundaries served his mission. Every no was about protecting the yes he came to live out. That should give us permission to stop feeling guilty when we have to draw lines. Saying no doesn't make you unloving. It makes you focused. Another thing boundaries do is create margin. If you say yes to every request, every opportunity, every expectation, you'll quickly find yourself running on fumes. And when you're running on fumes, you're not at your best for the things that actually matter. Think about your calendar for a second. How much of it is filled with things you felt obligated to do versus things that you actually were called to do? For many of us, that ratio is a little off. We confuse being busy with being fruitful, but they're not the same thing. I've heard someone describe their calendar as a piece of paper that reminds me of all the things past me thought present me would be capable of. That's the danger of a life without boundaries. We keep saying yes, and then we end up resenting the commitments we made. One feels counterintuitive, but it's true. Boundaries actually help us love better. Why? Because when you're clear about what you can and cannot do, the love you give is wholehearted. It's not half-hearted. It's not distracted or it's not resentful. Think of it like this. If you're stretched too thin, you might show up physically, but your heart is somewhere else. You're not really present. But when you set boundaries, you're able to give your full attention, energy, and love to the people and priorities God has placed in front of you. Jesus demonstrated this. He didn't heal every sick person in Israel. He didn't meet with every crowd. He didn't answer every demand, but the people he did encounter, he loved fully, healed completely, and taught truthfully. His boundaries didn't limit his love. They focused it. And at the heart of it, boundaries are about calling. God has given each of us a unique role to play. And if we're constantly bending to the will of others, we risk abandoning the path God set for us. Jesus understood this. He knew he was sent to preach the good news, to heal the brokenhearted, to set captives free, and ultimately to go to the cross. Anything that pulled him away from that, even if it looked good, had to be met with a no. Here's the reflection for us. What's the calling God has placed on your life? And what boundaries do you need to set in order to stay faithful to it? One of the last thoughts I want to give you here, boundaries are also an act of trust. When you say no, you're admitting that you're not the savior of the world. That role is already taken. You're trusting that God can handle the needs, the opportunities, and the expectations that you can't. That's what Jesus did. Every time he walked away from a crowd, every time he turned down a request, he was trusting that the Father's plan was enough. He didn't have to carry it all because he knew the Father was in control. And that's liberating for us too. You don't have to fix everything. You don't have to meet every need. You don't have to be available 24/7. God is God. You're not. Boundaries are how we live like that's true. So, what do we learn from Jesus' boundaries? That they're not walls to keep people out, but fences to keep us faithful. They create margin, protect calling, and free us to love better. Most importantly, they remind us that our ultimate yes belongs to God, not to the endless list of demands around us. Jesus' no's weren't about rejection. They were about redirection. And when we learn to say no like him, we discover that the freedom of boundaries is really the freedom to follow God's best. Okay, so we've spent some time looking at how Jesus said no to good things, people, expectations, how those boundaries teach us to guard our calling. But here's where it all comes together. Every no is really about making room for the right yes. Jesus didn't go around shutting doors. He was walking intentionally through the ones the Father had opened. Think about it. If Jesus had said yes to the crowd's desire to make him king, he never would have gone to the cross. If he had said yes to Peter's plea to avoid suffering, we'd still be stuck in our sin. If he'd said yes to every expectation, every demand, every opportunity, he would have been pulled in 1,000 directions, distracted from the very purpose he came for. But because he said no, he was free to say yes. Yes to the Father's will, yes to the cross, yes to the resurrection and redemption. His ultimate yes is the reason you and I are sitting here today with hope. That's the power of boundaries. They free us, not just from, but for. They free us from endless pressure and free us for joyful obedience. So what does this look like for us? What are the yeses God is inviting us into when we have the courage to say no somewhere else? We can say yes to deeper relationships. When you stop saying yes to everything, you actually have time to be present with the people who matter most. Your spouse, your kids, your close friends, your church community, the people God has entrusted to you. You can give them your best instead of just your leftovers. You can say yes to rest and renewal. Sabbath is one giant no so that we can say yes to the rest. Jesus, practicing this rhythm, he withdrew to pray. He took time away from the crowds. If the Son of God needed rest, you and I do too. Boundaries free us to say yes to breathing, recharging, and listening for God's voice. We can say yes to calling. Every person has a God-given calling. It may not be flashy or public, but it's significant. And you can't live into it if you're drowning in obligations that don't fit you. Boundaries help you stay in your lane so you can run your race. And we can say yes to eternal impact. When we stop being driven by guilt or pressure, we can be driven by love. That's when our yes starts to ripple onward, not because we are trying to do everything, but because we're doing the right things. And saying no, that's going to free you up from some of the sillier obligations in your life too. Like when you finally say no to signing up for another bake sale, and then you're not going to be up at midnight frantically Googling easy brownie recipe with only 3 ingredients. I mean, talk about ultimate freedom, right? Sometimes the yes is as simple as not being a stressed out version of yourself. The freedom of boundaries isn't just about living a less busy life. It's about living a more obedient one. When Jesus said yes to the Father, it wasn't easy. It took him all the way to Gethsemane. Sweat drops of blood as he prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." That yes changed the course of history. Our yeses may not be that dramatic, but they matter. Saying yes to praying with your kids. Yes to forgiving someone who hurt you. Yes to stepping into the ministry God's been nudging you toward. Yes to slowing down long enough to hear God's voice. Those yeses might not make headlines, but they make ripples that last into eternity. So here's the invitation. What do you need to say no to this week so you can say yes to what really matters? Maybe you need to say no to another work project so you can say yes to dinner with your family. Maybe you need to say no to social media scrolling so you can say yes to time in prayer. Maybe you need to say no to someone else's expectations so you can say yes to God's calling. Jesus shows us that the right yes is always worth the hard no. At the end of the day, boundaries aren't about missing out. They're about living with focus. They free us to give our best yes to the things God has placed right in front of us. And when we follow Jesus' example, we discover that the no's we once dreaded are actually the doorway to a richer, freer, more purposeful life. So let's be people who say no when we need to so we can say yes to the life God is calling us to live. Okay, we've walked through how Jesus said no to good things, no to people, no to expectations, and we've seen that his boundaries weren't about rejection. They were about direction. Every no protected a greater yes. Yes to the Father's will. Yes to the mission on the cross. Yes to the redemption of the world. And that's the lesson for us. Saying no isn't about being cold, selfish, or unavailable. It's about being faithful. It's about creating margins so that our yes means something. It's about focusing our time, our energy, and our hearts on the right things that matter most. So let me ask you, what do you need to say no to this week? Is it an opportunity that looks good but isn't right? A pressure from someone else that doesn't align with your calling? An expectation that's weighing you down? Whatever it is, I want you to see your no not as a loss, but as a gift, a way of protecting the yes that God is inviting you into. Because in the end, those yeses are what make ripples that last. And remember, small ripples can make a big impact. So go make yours. Hey, before you go, I'd really love to hear from you. Whether this episode encouraged you or brought up a question or just made you think, you can actually send a message straight to us. It's an easy way to share your thoughts or your story or even just say hello. Just click the link in the episode description to reach out. I read every message and I'd be honored to hear how God's moving in your life.